Hello and welcome to our week on loyalists and loyalism. Of course, that's a topic that follows on the heels of the American Revolution because, of course, the loyalists are those people who flee the American Revolution, flee the successful American Revolution, because they're the people who had stayed loyal to the British. Now, many more people, about 45,000 people crossed the border into Canada in the years right after 1783. And many more people than that were loyal to the British. You shouldn't think that so complete a part of the population sided with the revolution. But many of them found themselves in untenable positions, which is to say that they had been active supporters of the British rather than kind of passive supporters of the British. And that they just had been a little too outspoken, a little too clear in their loyalties. And some of them had kind of an incentive to go to Canada in the sense that their business prospects might have been better there than they were in the United States. There's all kinds of reasons for that. We don't need to get into that right now, although we will have cause to think about that in a few moments. Right now, I just want you to think about who these people are and what they're supposed to be all about. They're supposed to be all about loyalty to the empire. But what I want you to keep in mind as we have this discussion is that they're Americans, that they are people who are, for the vast majority of them, are born in the Americas, in British North America, and then a rebellion, a revolution, a civil war, if you will, breaks out in that land, and they're on the losing side. But they're still all Americans, and so that's an important thing to keep in mind. We tend to kind of turn them into monarchists and things like that, and I don't think that's an accurate way of thinking about it. Certainly some of them were, and we'll see that there's certainly a conservative, anti-liberal, anti-democratic dimension to some of them, but some of them were actually raised in a democratic environment, and they brought that spirit with them when they came to Upper Canada and Nova Scotia. So we'll explore that a little bit as we go. Of course, these people didn't enter an empty lot. They entered Indigenous territory that had seen very little active settlement on the part of Europeans, and certainly no treaty relationships with Indigenous people that resulted in any kind of land surrenders. So one of the first things the British do is engage in a series of treaties with Indigenous people around the northern shore of Lake Ontario, Lake Erie. Now these treaties are a little ambiguous. They're intended to be land surrender treaties, but when you read them, and when you read the descriptions, and when you just read the understandings of the treaties, it's not entirely clear that Indigenous people saw that they were permanently giving up land. There's certainly some indications in some of the treaties that they seem to be understanding themselves to be sharing that land with other people. In other words, allowing these refugees to come into their territory, not so much that they would then own it. And so that's a bit of a problem. But we're going to pursue that topic in a later week in more detail. Right now, all we're going to look at is the simple fact that it happened, and that the British, through a treaty process, saw fit. Remember the Royal Proclamation. The Royal Proclamation said that all that land west of the Appalachian Mountains was Indigenous territory. Well, that applies here in Upper Canada as well. And so they're formally following through on the terms of the Royal Proclamation, that they are formally acknowledging Indigenous rights, and at the same time taking them away through this treaty process, which they certainly portray as a mutually agreed arrangement. And this copy that you're looking at right now of one of those treaties, this is the Mississauga for the territory roughly from Scarborough, I don't know where that came from, Scarborough to Etobicoke, and then north up into King County. So a fairly big chunk of territory, which of course is basically the modern city of metropolitan Toronto. Not the GTA per se, but more than the kind of the old city of Toronto. So it's a fairly big piece of territory. They do this in several locations in what is now Upper Canada, and this map from 1805 illustrates this quite nicely. You can see a lot of the townships being laid out here. You see them particularly clearly in eastern Ontario, from Kingston up to Ottawa, and then over to the border of modern-day Quebec, and then along the shore of Lake Ontario, and then along the shore of Lake Erie. Not so much moving into Huronia, the country that was once the country of the Huron, of the Wyandot. But they're certainly leaving a mark on the land. They're certainly showing it now to be British territory. While much of that involves transfers out of Indigenous hands, some of it involves transfers into Indigenous hands. And here's a huge grant given to the Six Nations. Of course, this is an important topic. The Six Nations were active allies of the British in the American Revolution, and having come out on the losing side and with most of their land in what is now the United States, the Six Nations were certainly owed some kind of compensation for their sacrifices. And this is that compensation. It's a big chunk of land. And what I want you to see here is that this is not land that is parceled out to individual Six Nations people, individuals, families, anything like that. It's a big chunk of land parceled out to the Six Nations. In other words, it's a nation-to-nation arrangement between the British and the Haudenosaunee. And that's a really important consideration, because we often tend to think of this territory as a reserve. And while it was changed to a reserve in the 20th century, like quite late in the story, it certainly wasn't a reserve for the first years of its existence. In fact, it was considered Six Nations territory. So that really marks that kind of different dimension to the land transfers that we're looking at. I want you to see how big a chunk of land this is too. This is more or less going from Wainfleet in Niagara district of where we live today, all the way quite a ways up north. So you can see on the extreme upper left-hand side there, the townships of the Six Nations. So that's up past Waterloo. That's fairly far north. That's a big piece of land there that will become not the property, but the territory of the Haudenosaunee people. Haudenosaunee are led by this man, very famous figure in Canadian history, Joseph Brant. He's born in Mohawk. He's Mohawk, one of the Six Nations. So born in eastern New York in the early 18th century. Very intelligent man, very well educated man. Taken under the wing of Sir William Johnson, the British Indian agent in the territories of British North America in the 1750s and 60s. Receives a classical education at Yale, which is not Yale University yet. It's a divinity school, but he receives that kind of classical education there. So he's a very well-educated man for his time, and a very intelligent man for his time, and a very effective leader, both militarily and diplomatically. So a very important figure here in Canadian history in terms of establishing leadership for the Haudenosaunee as a Canadian people after the American Revolution. Other major leadership figure we can point to here is John Graves Simcoe. He's the first Lieutenant Governor of Upper Canada. He will leave a significant mark on the colony. He will establish many of its basic laws. Well, not individually, he won't. He'll do so under instructions from the British Colonial Office. But certainly he'll leave a particular mark on the colonies. And we'll have cause to talk about a little bit of that in a later lecture as well. What we need to just keep in mind here is that Simcoe, like Brant, is an important figure from the American Revolution, on the British side, of course. Simcoe was a commander in Queen's Rangers unit, a really quite successful Ranger unit from the American Revolution, not successful enough to win the war, but they were certainly successful enough to have done well on their own in their own particular battles. And so he certainly emerges as an influential and well-regarded figure, military figure, but also becomes a political figure after the American Revolution. So these people are arriving in the 1780s, and when we think of them, we think primarily, we think kind of different contradictory things. We tend to think they're kind of the elite figures. You know, they must be the rich people and the better educated and so on. That's certainly an image that was propagated in the 19th century by these people's descendants, as they tried to make a claim that the Loyalists were the kind of true founders of Canada. But they were a much more mixed population than that would suggest. And I think that actually goes to the other image we have of them, which is that they suffered enormously, that they endured ordeals for being loyal to the British. And this painting is not meant to actually illustrate that point, but it does certainly show off the fact that many of these early Loyalist settlements were simple, crude settlements. We're talking cutting down trees, building log cabins, and that many of these people were leaving behind fairly comfortable lives in what had become the United States. Many of these people had been there for 2-3 generations, had built up substantial farms, substantial businesses, And so they were really starting over here. And so we should certainly acknowledge and understand the significance of the sacrifice that they did make. So let's look a little bit at the numbers here. And the numbers are really important, not just because they show a simple measure of people, because it actually leads to some of the politics that's underway here. In 1783, approximately 7,500 Loyalists crossed into Upper Canada. Now, many more went into Nova Scotia. Actually, over 30,000 went into Nova Scotia. But we're not talking about Nova Scotia here today. We're just looking at Upper Canada. So roughly 7,500 come into Upper Canada in 1783. And these are the people who were clearly fleeing persecution in the United States. And the colonial government, British colonial government, sets up a fairly generous system to receive them, including grants of land for Loyalists and Loyalist families coming into the country. It's kind of a hierarchy here. Certainly the better off ones get more land, military officers get more land. Certainly the poorer settlers tend to be kind of treated later and receive smaller chunks of land, smaller parcels of land. But they certainly are generally received fairly comfortably. Although, again, not in any way downplaying the suffering that they endured. The thing is, in 1783, it's pretty clear that these people are fleeing persecution. By 1791, 8 years later, there are 31,000 Loyalists in Upper Canada. That's a lot more. And as time went on, people began to ask questions about these people and to say, were you really persecuted in America? Are you really fleeing persecution in America? Are you actually a Loyalist? Or are you here for the free land? And so that was really kind of calling into question their loyalty. I mean, they're Loyalists. Are they really loyal? And this is going to become a kind of burning question over the next 20 years of who these people really are. And are they deserving of the special treatment they're receiving here in British North America, or are they just here for free land? So, as governor, Simcoe takes it upon himself to create, and this is his terminology, to create a truly British colony. And this is, again, and much of this whole story is directly in response to the American Revolution. So what he sees is a failure in America to maintain it as a British place. And so his policies will be designed to try to keep it British. Now, British is, of course, an ethnic terminology, and to make it British is kind of difficult when most of them are Americans, many of them are German, many of them are Irish, many of them are Jewish, many of them are Aboriginal, many of them are African American. So ethnicity doesn't seem to be a particularly good measure of what British means in this particular context. There's also a religious dimension to this, and we're going to pursue this more in our next discussion, so I won't talk a whole lot about it here, but certainly one dimension of Simcoe's plans will be to make Upper Canada an Anglican place. In other words, to follow the state Church of England, the official religion of the Church of England, and to give that kind of religious stamp on what marks a loyal place. And so many of his policies will be geared towards encouraging, promoting, and actually strengthening the hold of the Anglican Church in Upper Canada. A key feature of all of this is that American is something that's problematic. So much of what happens here is to say that things are not American, and more particularly to say that we're not Republican. And I very carefully make that a small r, because I don't want you to confuse that with the political party that exists today, Donald Trump's party today. I don't want you to be thinking that way. I mean Republican in the classical sense of a government of the people, a bottom-up form of government in the classical Greek sense that the French and the Americans will adopt in their revolutions as they invent the modern democratic republic in the 18th and 19th centuries. But in British North America, this kind of notion that Republican really represents rebellion. Republican really represents the disavowal of legitimate authority. So American and Republican becomes a way to identify these problematic positions. So much of the policy that emerges in Upper Canada in this time period is deliberately and clearly anti-democratic. Now, we've got to be careful here. One of the first things they do, and we already saw this, we saw this in the Constitution Act of 1791, is they set up a democratic assembly. So you shouldn't think anti-democratic means no rights for the people. It's a case of how many powers you're going to give to those democratic institutions. So yes, they created an assembly, but they're not going to have any local government. New England is famous for local government. Townships build roads, build hospitals. They do all kinds of basic institutional, infrastructural kinds of governing policies. That's not going to happen in Upper Canada. It's going to be a highly centralized form of government. Individual locations, townships, counties, and so on will send representatives to an assembly that will meet in the capital once a year. But that'll be the limits to that democracy. And even then, you're going to reserve many powers for the British appointed governor rather than for the elected assembly. And so that's what I'm really getting at here when I'm talking about anti-democratic. It's more the balance of power that's being struck here rather than whether or not it's a democracy. It's a democracy, it's just kind of a weak democracy. And part of the political story of the next 30, 40, 50 years will be attempts to push the democratic envelope further, to make this a more democratic society. We'll talk about that in a later course as well, later week as well. So you see some policies put in place. The state church, I've already mentioned this. You see a strong militia put in place that men between the ages of 18 and 45 must sign up for the militia, must contribute to the militia, and must be available to support the defense of the colony. And of course, in the immediate aftermath of the American Revolution, there's probably not much chance of a war. But there's certainly concerns in Britain that something else will happen, and they certainly recognize themselves to be vulnerable. Because once the British pull their troops out of America, the United States suddenly has an overwhelming military advantage. So it's entirely possible that they might try to take Canada from Britain. So certainly the militia was seen to be very, very important to them. And then another dimension of this is the weak assembly. So you got a kind of collection of policies designed to enforce a kind of British sense of where loyalty should be owed, and of where power should lie. And there's clearly a kind of elite sense here that elites should run the society. So a weak assembly is certainly very much a part of that. You'll have militia run by officers, elite figures. You'll have a state church with bishops and priests guiding the flock, as they might term it. So again, a kind of top-down view throughout all these kinds of dimensions of British policy in Upper Canada. In the midst of all this, and I can't stress this enough, that many of these people are, I keep saying this, they're Americans. So many of them are expecting basic democratic institutions. So they criticize these new arrangements. In this context, where the British are trying to strengthen their hold on this place, that kind of criticism is not viewed as legitimate dissent. It's called disloyalty. So when people criticize the democratic faults of Upper Canada, these people don't deal with this, or the elite figures, I should say, don't deal with these people in a debate. They just say, no, you're disloyal. You're going against the British ways that we've established in this colony. And that's not a very good argument, because it really ignores the substance of what the critics are saying. But it's also a very effective argument because it paints those people in a bad light. People stop listening when they think, oh yes, that's disloyal. Well, that's not the sharpest political engagement you can imagine, but it's an effective strategy, and it certainly thwarts many of the early attempts at democratic reform in Upper Canada. Much of this is going to get tested during the War of 1812, and we can think of the War of 1812 as a period when loyalties get tested, that people need to show their loyalties in clear, unequivocal fashions. Because there's a war on, and if you're actually going to defend the colony, if you're going to prevent an invasion from taking place, you need to be willing to kill people. You need to be willing to risk your own life. So these are serious claims on loyalty, and the War of 1812 will become part of that test. Now, the War of 1812 is, I think Canadians often mistake this for a war between Canada and the United States. It's not. It's a war between Britain and the United States, and Canada is a British colony, so that's why we're at war with them. But it's really a British-American war, and it really stems from a whole range of issues. It ranges from trade issues, all kinds of particular things that set it off, but those are actually kind of excuses in the end to start the war. The larger issue related to the interior of the continent, where the British continued to supply troops to indigenous people there, particularly in the Ohio River Valley. And of course, those indigenous people are fighting a frontier war against American intrusions into their territory. So the Americans see the British as directly contributing to indigenous resistance against their expanded settlement areas. And of course, the Royal Proclamation does not apply in the United States anymore. They're happily moving into that territory. And to see the British arming indigenous people there certainly angered the Americans, because certainly from their perspective, it's arming the enemy. And so that was a serious bone of contention. But there's other issues as well. And it's also tied up with the Napoleonic Wars that are going on in Europe. Britain and France are at war. The Americans and the French are allied. There are trade issues. There's all kinds of substantial issues on the table. And the result is that America wants to invade Canada, because they're really just trying to get rid of that British territory that adjoins them, which of course they see as a threat to their own existence. There's two not phases, that's not the word I'm looking for. There's two dimensions to the war. One is a maritime dimension. By that I mean an ocean dimension of the war. The Royal Navy is the most powerful navy in the world, so they generally control the North Atlantic. The Americans do not have they certainly have some successes. They certainly have certainly lots of piracy going on where American privateering vessels are successfully capturing British vessels. But generally speaking, the Royal Navy controls the North Atlantic. And so there's never any kind of threat to Nova Scotia. Remember, in the American Revolution, there were certainly thoughts that American troops could capture Nova Scotia. There's no such thoughts in the War of 1812 because the Royal Navy effectively hems the American Navy in. This is a painting from 1813. This is HMS Shannon, British ship, delivering back to Halifax a captured American vessel, the Chesapeake, and of course humiliating it by having the British flag flying over the American flag. So it's a capture, and this is the pride of the American Navy. It's the biggest ship in their fleet, powerful vessel with many guns, and it's the kind of vessel that should have been able to play a significant role on the open ocean in battle with the British, but it didn't. It was captured fairly easily and then brought back in humiliation. But most of the war takes place in the interior of the continent, particularly in the area around the Great Lakes. And again, if this sounds familiar from the War of 1812, it should, because much of this involves transportation routes, access to the fur trade, access to the interior, access to settlement areas, and of course encounters with indigenous peoples. This map shows nicely the kind of four major zones where many of the battles will take place. Up in the north, you can see the passageway between Lake Michigan and Lake Huron. The passage is guarded by Fort Michilimackinac, which at the beginning of the war is an American position, but which is captured by General Brock very early in the late summer of 1812. Then below that, down in the Detroit-Windsor area, Brock again has another success at Detroit-Windsor just about a month later, in September of 1812. Easily captures Detroit from the Americans, a significant success for the British, and that comes with significant indigenous support, in part from the Haudenosaunee, the Six Nations, but mostly from the Shawnee people from the Ohio River Valley, in other words, the area due south of there. Because these are the people that are most feeling American pressure, and these are the ones who are most enthusiastically willing to support the British. They certainly see the British at this point as clear allies in their own existential battle with America. The third zone we can look at is right here in the area that we live today in the Niagara Peninsula, and of course that's a passageway from New York straight into Upper Canada, and several major battles will be fought there, and we'll get there in a minute. And then the fourth area we can look at is that kind of up through Lake Champlain, through to Montreal and Quebec, to the St. Lawrence River, and certainly the Americans, as they had, we saw again during the American Revolution, saw fit to invade there. So will the Americans in the War of 1812. There'll be a significant battle there that we'll talk about here in a moment. We can't cover all of this in a course like this, so I'll just say really, really quickly, certainly the most famous battle, probably the most significant battle from a defensive perspective for the British is the Battle of Queenston Heights. So this would be the third major battle of General Brock's fall of 1812. Also a success, this one a defensive success rather than an offensive success. So having captured Michilimackinac and preserved access to the interior for the British, having captured Detroit and limited an American intrusion through the southern end of Lake Erie, now we're at the other end of Lake Erie, at the connection between Lake Erie and Lake Ontario, and the British are looking to hold back the American advance there. So this is not a penetration into America as Detroit was or Michilimackinac was. This is a defensive measure, and the Americans are trying to cross the Niagara River to capture the town of, well, Queenston, but eventually Niagara-in-the-Lake, what's then called Newark, and hopefully to move right into the peninsula of Upper Canada. It's a failed invasion. It's an invasion where the British troops with some Canadian militia and a lot of Six Nations Shawnee support successfully hold back the American invasion. I love this illustration. This is a contemporary illustration showing, like many illustrations we see in this course, it's showing not one event at one moment, but a whole series of events taking place in one image. But you can see the American soldiers on the American side crossing the river on the boats. Some troops on the sidelines there firing, not very effectively, one would imagine, across the river into the battle scene. You can see that some of the vessels, some soldiers falling out of the vessels. That was certainly a problem for some of the Americans. This illustration also nicely shows some of the battle scenes taking place there. Conspicuously absent in this view is any indication that there are Indigenous warriors fighting here, and there are several hundred, and they're going to play a significant role here. But we see lots of details, including the death of Brock, here shown really quite clearly on the illustration, but not the Indigenous fighters. Brock dies that day, but to that point in time, he was absolutely clear in his thinking of how to fight this battle. He had to fight in two ways. One, he had to fight aggressively. He had to go after the Americans rather than letting them come to him. This was not a preferred battle for Brock. Brock would have liked to have been crossing that river himself. He was put in a position where he saw an invasion force coming, and he had to defend against it. But the other two attacks, Detroit and Michilimackinac, were attempts on his part to take the battle to them. There's certainly divided strategies in the British ranks as to which is the best approach to defend or to attack, but we don't really need to get into that. But the second thing that Brock was absolutely clear on was that he did not see value in the Canadian militia units. In fact, he was looking at this issue of the late Loyalists, those people that we were talking about, those later groups of Loyalists that are showing up in the 1790s. And he's looking at people like that, and not just individually, but he's just looking at this in general and saying, are these people we can really rely on? And he means that in two ways. One, he means it in terms of just skill and capacity. Are these people trained to be soldiers? But more particularly, he wonders where their hearts are, because to be able to fight in this kind of situation, you have to believe in what you're doing. And he doesn't see people that believe what they're doing. In fact, in many ways, he's right. Lots of these later Loyalists turn out to be less than loyal. Many of them cross back into the United States, serve in American military units. And more of them, though, just show a kind of reluctance to show up for militia training, to show up for actual militia duty. And so certainly there's a sense in Upper Canada in 1812 and 1813, and this act passed in 1813, this emergency legislation indicating that this list of people, and there's many hundreds more that they're looking at, should be arrested for treason. These are people who are not supporting Britain in this moment of need. So again, there's this kind of pervading sense that these people can't be trusted, and certainly Brock thinks that. And so when he's asked who he can rely on, he says two groups of people. He says his own British troops and the Indigenous warriors that they're allied with. Those are the people that he knows, and he knows that you need to feel this. He knows that clearly. And his troops are loyal troops, they're well-trained troops, they will fight. The Indigenous warriors have a stake in this. They will lose their lands. They will lose themselves as a people if they lose this war. They have a real stake in this. So he knows he can rely on them too. He knows they're good warriors. He knows they're well-trained. and this is how he thinks the war will be won. He'll die in the fall of 1812, but certainly that ongoing thinking of who can be relied on in this moment will continue throughout the war. As the war progresses, more and more men will show up effectively, and those militia units will become more important. But early in the war, they're not that significant. Interestingly, a place where local soldiers do show themselves to be loyal, ironically, takes place in Lower Canada. The Battle of Chateauguay, just south of Montreal, features an armed invasion featuring 2 times as many American troops invading against a half-sized French-Canadian militia commanded not by British officers, but by French-Canadian militia officers. The French-Canadians win. They win the Battle of Chateauguay against all odds. Poor training, poorer numbers, but they win the day. It's a successful battle, in part because of the tactics they use, and we don't have a whole lot of time to discuss these things here today, but also in part because of a sound plan, sound organization, sound discipline deployed during the battle, and also enforcing the Americans to fight on some terrain that they weren't comfortable fighting on. It meant a successful battle, and it also meant that Lower Canada was, in the summer of 1813, protected from a major invasion. An invasion that, had this battle failed, almost certainly would have resulted in the capture of Montreal. So there you have it, French Canadians and Indigenous people truly fighting the War of 1812 and truly demonstrating their value and clearly fighting for their own interests. Not necessarily in a British cause, allied with the British cause, but not in the British cause. And so lots of Indigenous warriors and French Canadians showed themselves to be loyal in that sense that really mattered during a battle. By far the most important Indigenous contribution comes from the Haudenosaunee, the Six Nations, and here we see Six Nation chiefs from 1871, some of whom were alive in 1812. They would have been young in 1812, but were alive at the time. And they are recalling through the use of wampum belts both their relationship with the British and their contribution to the War of 1812. The Haudenosaunee played a major role in the war in several battles, and again they were counted upon as reliable soldiers with good military training, and many of their officers were important in several of the battles. What we need to keep in mind is that they are there because of the covenant chain, an arrangement, an agreement, a protocol that was established between the British and the Haudenosaunee in 1667. And here we are 150 years later, and the Haudenosaunee continually refer to the covenant chain as the basis for the relationship, the basis for trust between these two nations. So this is a long-standing, enduring contribution and relationship between the two peoples that the Haudenosaunee are determined to maintain. The British less enthusiastically, and with time even further less enthusiastically, as they see less need for this Haudenosaunee support. But certainly in the 17th and 18th and early 19th centuries, the Haudenosaunee put this forth powerfully, effectively, and usefully for the British. So there's all kinds of things we can take from this discussion, from the War of 1812 in particular. There's lots of mythologies attached to the War of 1812, that we beat the Americans. We didn't beat the Americans. Certainly some of we played a contributing role, but really British troops with significant support from Indigenous allies defeated the Americans, certainly in battles like the Battle of Queenston Heights. It also allowed Canadians in the 19th and 20th centuries to kind of create some heroes for themselves. And we often say in Canada we don't have heroes, and sometimes we say we kind of take them down too easily. And maybe that's true, but it's certainly some kind of nationalist mythology certainly emerged around Brock and his defense of Upper Canada. Was he a valiant general? Absolutely was. Was he a smart and aggressive general? Absolutely was. Was he the person that saved Canada? I'm not so sure about that. It's a significant battle, but when we focus on that one man like that, we ignore the contributions even of the militiamen, but certainly of the British soldiers that were involved, and certainly of the indigenous warriors that were involved. There's also this kind of fetishization of the death and the way he died, that he said, "Surgite," push on, in his dying moments, which is probably not true. We have no idea. We have one report of this, and it seems an unlikely thing to say when you're dying. He might have said, "Carry on the good fight, guys," or something like that, but it's unlikely that he would have gone to Latin. In fact, there's probably more prosaic things he might have been saying after he was shot. The bigger issue, though, that emerges from the War of 1812, and the success that the British troops and ultimately the militia units have in the War of 1812, is this equation of loyalism as the ideology of Canada. And that part of that is an anti-republican feeling, an anti-democratic feeling. That it was loyalty that allowed Americans to be defeated. It was loyalism that allowed this kind of small colony to hold back this emerging powerful country. Again, it's a compelling argument if you ignore lots of things, but you have to ignore a lot of things to see that. But the bottom line is that it allows loyalists to say that our political principles have allowed us to have this society that held back this emerging world power. They didn't pose it as an emerging world power, but it was certainly a bigger army, and they knew it was a bigger army. But again, there's all kinds of factors that we need to look at, and it certainly wasn't just loyalism that held back all those American troops.